Tonight, we settle in for a long, quiet journey across a golden sea. We follow 3 children, 2 of them old friends of a very magical world, and one who has never believed in magic at all, as they sail toward the edge of everything. This is the Chronicles of Narnia, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow. We have a long, peaceful voyage ahead of us. But before that, my name's Murphy, and I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. If this brings you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Let your body grow comfortable and still, and allow this story to carry you gently forward. Our story begins in England during the Second World War. It's the kind of time when ordinary life felt heavier than usual, when cities were loud with worry and families were separated from each other in ways that no one had planned. Against this backdrop, 2 children named Lucy and Edmund Pevensey found themselves far from home, staying with relatives in a town called Cambridge. Lucy was the younger of the 2. She had warm eyes and a quiet kind of confidence that came not from being loud or bold, but from having seen things, truly remarkable things, that very few people ever get to see. She carried herself with a certain softness, but there was something underneath it, something steady and sure, like the feeling of solid ground under thick grass. She smiled easily, but it was never an empty smile. When Lucy smiled, it meant something, because Lucy herself meant things. She took them seriously, she held them carefully, and the world mattered to her in a way that was quite specific and quite complete. Edmund was older, a little more reserved, the kind of boy who thought carefully before he spoke, and who had learned, through his own experience, that being honest was far more important than being liked. He had not always believed this. There had been a time when he had made choices that were not honest, not kind, not good. Choices that he had since made his peace with, but that still lived somewhere in him as a reminder of what he did not want to be again. That reminder had made him better. He was more careful now, more considered, more genuinely attentive to the people around him than someone watching from the outside might have expected. The 2 of them were staying in the home of their Aunt Alberta and Uncle Harold, a neat, tidy household where everything was kept in its proper place and where imagination was considered, more or less, a waste of time. Their cousin Eustace Harold Scrubb lived there too, and Eustace was, to put it gently, not the easiest person to spend time with. Eustace was a boy who prided himself on knowing things. He read books, certainly, but only the kind that listed facts in columns and left no room for anything that couldn't be measured or explained. He had little patience for stories, less patience for people who believed in stories, and almost no patience at all for Lucy and Edmund, whom he found irritating in ways he was very happy to describe at length. He didn't like them, and he made sure they knew it. He called their talk of other worlds childish. He called their memories of Narnia a shared delusion. He said things like this with a satisfied look on his face, the way some people do when they believe that being unkind is the same as being clever. Eustace kept a diary. Not the private, uncertain kind. Not the sort of diary where you write down what you actually feel and then stare at the page and wonder whether feeling that way makes you strange. Eustace's diary was more like a ledger. He wrote observations about the people around him, assessments of their behavior, records of the ways they had inconvenienced or disappointed him. It was very neatly written and very thoroughly unsympathetic. It was also, in its own particular way, the most honest thing about him. because the diary revealed, to any careful reader, that Eustace was paying a great deal of attention to the people he claimed not to care about. Lucy and Edmund were used to Eustace by now. They didn't argue with him. They simply lived alongside him, doing their best in a house that didn't quite feel like home, in a world that was nothing like the one they missed. Lucy's room in the house was plain, but pleasant enough. There was a window that looked out onto the grey Cambridge sky, a small wardrobe, a writing desk, and on one wall, a painting. It was the painting that mattered most. It had been there before she arrived. A framed image of a ship at sea, painted in deep blues and warm golds. The ship was sailing across open water, its painted sails full of what looked like a painted wind, and if you looked at it for long enough, something about it felt alive. Lucy loved it immediately. She would sit across from it and simply look, and something in her chest would grow warm and quiet, the way it did when she thought of Narnia. One afternoon, Lucy and Edmund were in her room. Eustace had followed them in, not because he wanted to spend time with them, but because he wanted to complain about them being in the house at all. He was saying something critical about the painting, the way he said something critical about most things. He thought it was ugly. He thought the colors were overdone. He thought the waves looked ridiculous. And then the waves moved. It was subtle at first. Just the faintest shimmer, like light passing across the surface of real water. Edmund noticed it first. Then Lucy. They both went very still. The air in the room changed, becoming cooler and carrying with it the faint, unmistakable smell of salt. The kind of salt that belongs to open oceans, to wide skies, to places that are nothing at all like Cambridge. Eustace didn't notice. He kept talking. He said the painting was a poor imitation of something that wasn't worth imitating, and that whoever had bought it had wasted their money. But while he talked, the painting continued to change. The ship moved. It actually moved, tilting gently as though the sea beneath it had remembered it was real. The waves grew larger, rising and falling in slow, rolling motions, and the sky above the painted horizon deepened to a shade of blue that no painted sky had any right to be. Eustace stepped closer to the painting to look at it more carefully. He reached out a hand toward it, and the moment his fingers touched the frame, the world came apart in the most wonderful, terrifying, breathless way. The painting expanded. There is no other way to describe it. The frame seemed to fall away, and the scene inside grew and grew until there was no longer a painting at all, only an ocean, a real, rolling, cold, blue ocean, filling the room from wall to wall, the smell of it sharp and clean and impossibly alive. Water poured in over the edge of where the frame had been. It ran across the floor, cold and quick, and all three children stumbled backward towards the far wall. But there was no stopping what was happening. The pull was gentle at first, almost like the tide going out, drawing everything with it. Then it was stronger. Lucy felt herself lifted, felt the salt water close over her feet, her knees, her waist, and then, for one dizzying, wind-swept moment, she was in the painting. She was in the ocean. They all were. The water was cold and the waves were real, and the sky above was a shade of blue that looked painted precisely because it was too beautiful to be ordinary. Edmund surfaced beside her, already trying to swim. Eustace surfaced a moment later, sputtering and furious and very wet, shouting about lawsuits and irresponsibility and how this simply couldn't be happening, which, as anyone who has ever fallen into a magical ocean can tell you, is precisely the wrong thing to shout. The waves were not cruel, but they were large. The children were carried up and down by them, trying to keep their heads above water, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. And then, through the spray and the noise and the wide, impossible blue, they saw it. A ship. It cut through the water with a kind of grace that seemed impossible for something that large. Its hull was painted gold, and at its prow, carved in wood with great care, was the shape of a lion's head. Golden, fierce, and beautiful. The sails above were full of real wind, and the flag that flew at the top of the mast was one that Lucy recognized immediately. Her heart did something she had been waiting a long time for it to do. She was home. Ropes were thrown from the deck of the ship. Hands reached down. One by one, the children were pulled up from the cold water and brought aboard, wrapped in warm cloths, and set down on the solid, gently rocking deck. The ship was called the Dawn Treader, and it was the most beautiful vessel any of them had ever seen. The wood beneath their feet was smooth and well kept. The ropes were neat, the sails were full and white, and everything about the ship had the feeling of something cared for, a thing that mattered to the people who sailed it. The crew moved around them quickly, but without fuss, checking that the children were unharmed, bringing warm drinks, wrapping blankets around their shoulders. Eustace did not appreciate any of this. He was still spluttering, still insisting that this was impossible, still demanding to know what was happening and who was responsible. The crew paid him a certain amount of calm attention and went about their business. Lucy and Edmund, meanwhile, were looking around with wide eyes and full hearts, taking in every detail. The carved lion at the prow, the golden hull, the smell of the sea and the wood and the salt air, and feeling, in the way that only happens when you return to somewhere you love after a long time away, that the world had righted itself in some quiet, deep way. And then a voice called out from above them. He came down from the upper deck with the easy confidence of someone who has spent enough time at sea to stop thinking about the ship and simply be on it. He was older than they remembered. Not old, exactly, but grown. His face settled into the shape of a young man's face, rather than a boy's. He wore a simple travelling cloak over his clothes, and his hair was longer, and when he saw Lucy and Edmund, his expression shifted in a way that was very difficult to describe. Surprise and relief and happiness all arriving at once, like three friends who had agreed to meet somewhere, and all turned up at the same moment. This was King Caspian, and he was, by any measure, genuinely glad to see them. He came towards them with his arms already open, and Lucy embraced him without a second's hesitation. Edmund shook his hand, and then thought better of it, and embraced him too. They were laughing and talking over each other, the way people do when there is too much to say, and too little time, and the happiness is simply too large to fit into ordinary sentences. Eustace watched all of this with deep suspicion. Caspian looked at the three of them, his eyes bright, and told them they were welcome aboard the Dawn Treader. He said the sea had brought them here for a reason, the way Narnia had always seemed to arrange things when something important needed doing. He brought them below deck to warm themselves and change into dry clothes, and then, when they were settled and comfortable, he sat with them and began to explain. Caspian's explanation took some time, and he gave it carefully, the way someone gives careful information when they know the people listening need to understand every part of it. He told them about 7 lords of Narnia. They were loyal men, noble men, who had served his father before Miraz. Caspian's treacherous uncle had come to power. When Miraz seized the throne and made life difficult for anyone who might challenge him, he had sent these 7 lords away. He had dispatched them on a mission to sail east, into the uncharted seas beyond Narnia's known waters, and they had never come back. Whether they were lost or dead or stranded somewhere, no one knew. What Caspian knew was that he had promised to find them, or to find out what had happened to them. A king's promise, he said, was not something you put away when it became inconvenient. There was more than the promise, though. Each of the 7 lords had been entrusted with one of 7 magical swords. Swords that, according to old knowledge and older legend, needed to be brought together to the eastern edge of the world and laid on a table called Aslan's table. If they were not brought together, a darkness growing somewhere in those eastern seas, a green, creeping mist that swallowed people and places and fed on something dark inside the soul, would continue to spread. It was already touching the edges of things. It was already taking people. So the Dawn Treader was sailing east. It had been sailing east for some time. It would keep sailing east until they found what they were looking for, or reached the very end of the world. There was one more member of the crew that Lucy and Edmund had not yet greeted properly, and they found him that evening, standing near the prow of the ship in the last light of the day. A small figure, barely reaching Edmund's knee, covered in grey fur that caught the fading gold of the sunset. He had bright eyes and a very small sword at his side, and the bearing of someone who believed in things completely, without apology. Reepicheep the mouse. He bowed to Lucy with great dignity, and she crouched down and greeted him with equal care, because she knew from long experience that Reepicheep was a creature who deserved exactly that. He was the bravest soul on the ship, and he would have found the suggestion that his size had anything to do with his courage completely baffling. He had come on this voyage for his own reason. He had always believed, since he was very young, that he was meant to sail to the edge of the world and find Aslan's country, the place beyond the world, the place where everything good lives forever. It was not ambition that drove him. It was something quieter and deeper. A calling, perhaps, the kind of thing that doesn't let you go once it has found you. There was something else about Reepicheep that was worth noticing, something that took a little time to see clearly. And that was this. He was genuinely happy. Not the loud, demanding happiness that insists on being recognized, but a settled, clear happiness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you believe and exactly where you are going, and finding both of those things good. He moved through the ship with the quiet energy of someone whose days had a purpose and whose nights had a peace. And being near him had a particular effect on people. They tended, without quite knowing why, to feel a little more certain about things when Reepicheep was nearby. Eustace had not settled in. He complained about the food, about the sleeping arrangements, about the smell of the ship, about the size of his bunk, about Reepicheep, who he found alarming, and about Narnia in general, which he was not entirely convinced was real. He wrote in his diary every day. Careful, precise entries full of observations about the people around him, none of them particularly flattering. He was not a bad boy, exactly. He was a boy who had been taught that the world worked in certain ways, and the Dawn Treader was not cooperating with any of them. Lucy, meanwhile, settled in the way she always had in Narnia. Easily, naturally, like water finding its level. She helped where she could, talked with the crew, stood at the railing in the mornings and watched the ocean wake up. Edmund did similar things. They both felt the quiet joy of being back, the particular comfort of a place that knows you, even if that place is a moving ship in the middle of a sea you have never sailed before. The Dawn Treader moved on, east, always east, and the sky above it was wide and blue and full of a kind of peace that England just then could not quite manage. The days at sea had their own shape. Mornings arrived slowly, the sky lightening before the sun cleared the horizon, and the crew would be up before the light was fully there, going about the business of the ship with the quiet efficiency of people who have done these tasks so many times that they no longer need to think about them. The sails were checked, the ropes were seen to. Someone always made something warm to drink, and brought it to whoever was on watch, and the drink was accepted and held with both hands, in the particular way of someone who is grateful for a small warmth in a large, cool world. In the afternoons, the sun was high, and the sea was bright, and the deck was a pleasant place to sit, and people did sit there, in ones and twos, talking or not talking, watching the water, or mending things, or doing the quiet, repetitive tasks that sea life requires, and that have their own particular comfort. There is something deeply restful about useful repetition, something that lets the mind go quiet while the hands stay busy. Eustace was beginning, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, to learn the ropes, not metaphorically. Literally, the actual ropes of the ship, which ones controlled which sails, how the rigging worked, why things were tied the particular ways they were. He learned these things with the same careful attention he had always given to facts and categories, but for the first time, the facts were also useful, and the usefulness of them was satisfying in a way that knowing the Latin name of an insect was not. He did not say this to anyone, but you could see it in his face, in the particular concentration he brought to tying a knot correctly, and the satisfaction, private and quiet, when it held. After a number of days at sea, days that had a pleasant sameness to them, marked by meals and shifting winds and the slow passage of clouds across the sky, land appeared on the horizon. It was a low, grey-green shape at first, then gradually more defined, until they could see buildings along the shore and docks jutting out into the water and the general busy atmosphere of a working port. This was the first of the Lone Islands, a collection of small island territories that had once been under Narnian rule. Narrow Haven was the main port, and as the dawn treader drew close, the crew prepared to dock and go ashore. Caspian wanted to greet the governor, resupply the ship, and learn whatever could be learned about the 7 lost lords. It was meant to be a straightforward visit. It was not a straightforward visit. They had barely gone a little way into the town when trouble found them. It arrived in the form of men. Rough, businesslike men who moved with the practiced ease of people who do unpleasant things for a living and have long stopped thinking of those things as unpleasant. They emerged quickly, surrounding the small group from the ship, and before anyone could do much about it, Lucy, Edmund, and several crew members were seized and pulled away from the docks. Caspian was caught too. In the confusion, none of the captors seemed to know who he was. He was just another young man from a foreign ship, and they treated him accordingly. Which is to say, as a commodity, a thing to be sold. The slave trade had taken root in the Lone Islands. It had grown quietly, the way bad things tend to grow when no one with authority bothers to stop them. The current governor, a man named Gumpas, was more interested in records and ledgers than in justice, and the slave traders had found in him someone who was willing to look the other way in exchange for things that suited him. The people taken from the docks and the streets were brought to a market, sorted and assessed, and prepared to be sold. Lucy was kept separate from the others. She was frightened, though she was also, underneath the fear, something else, something quietly stubborn that she had always had, a refusal to give in to hopelessness before it was absolutely necessary. She watched what was happening around her with careful eyes, and she waited. Caspian, in the chaos of the capture, had managed to keep his identity hidden. The slave traders didn't know they had the King of Narnia among their inventory. He used this, He moved among the other captives and the traders with a kind of deliberate calm, speaking quietly to people, gathering information, looking for Lucy and the others. At the market, he presented himself not as a prisoner, but as a buyer. He had enough authority in his bearing, the kind that comes from actually being a king, even when you're pretending not to be, to make people believe him. He asked questions in the idle, interested way of a man considering a purchase, and the traders answered him, because that is what traders do when they think they are making a sale. He found where Lucy was being held. He found Edmund. He began to understand the shape of the place, the layout of the market, the positions of the guards, the way the operation was organized, and he filed it all away, quietly and carefully, for the moment when he would stop pretending. That moment came. With Reepicheep and several crew members who had managed to stay free arriving as backup, Caspian drew himself up to his full height, and in a voice that had no pretending in it at all, made clear who he was. He was King Caspian of Narnia. These islands fell under Narnian jurisdiction, and what was happening here, the buying and selling of people, was going to stop. The traders were, briefly, at a loss. This is the thing about authority, real authority. It has a quality to it that is very difficult to argue with, even when you want to. Caspian had it. The crew of the Dawn Treader, rallying around him, added to it considerably, and Reepicheep, small but absolutely resolute, his tiny sword drawn and his eyes bright with the kind of conviction that doesn't waver, added something else entirely. The Governor Gumpus was summoned. He arrived with the flustered, defensive manner of someone who knows they have been caught doing something wrong, but has not yet decided whether to admit it. He began to cite trade statistics and economic necessity, and the general complexity of things. Caspian listened to a certain amount of this with a patience that was very deliberate, and then he indicated, clearly and without anger, but without any room for misunderstanding either, that the statistics were not the point. Gumpus was removed from his position. Caspian did this with the straightforward authority of a king who has found that the person managing something important has been managing it very badly, and has decided that a change is needed. It was not dramatic. It was simply the right thing done in the right way. The people who had been taken to the market and prepared for sale were freed. There was no ceremony about this. They were let go. Families found each other. The market, which had been humming with the noise of a business being conducted, went quiet, and then filled with a different kind of noise altogether. Caspian installed someone new in Gumpus's place. Someone who could be trusted to govern the islands with fairness, and to remember that Narnia was still watching. He did this quickly and practically, because there was still a voyage to complete, and the sea was waiting. Among the people they encountered at the Lone Islands was a man named Bern. He was one of the 7 lords. He had ended up here, years ago, after Miraz sent him east. He had settled, built a life, married, and put down roots in the way that people do when they stop expecting to go home. He was a good man, steady and honest, and he recognized Caspian with a mixture of sadness and relief that comes from knowing that the world you left is still out there somewhere, still asking things of you. Bern gave Caspian his sword, one of the 7, 1 down, 6 to find. He could not leave his home and his family to join the voyage, and no one asked him to. Caspian thanked him, and they parted with the quiet warmth of people who have shared something important and know they are unlikely to meet again. The sword was placed carefully aboard the Dawn Treader. The crew understood what it meant. 6 more, and they could finish what they had come to do. They left Narrowhaven on a clear morning, with the wind in the right direction and the sea relatively calm. The town fell behind them, the docks growing smaller, and then vanishing into the general grey-green of the island. And then there was just the ocean again, wide and blue and full of possibility, in the way that open water always is. The crew settled back into the rhythm of the voyage. Eustace continued to be Eustace, though perhaps slightly less confidently than before. The events at Narrowhaven had been difficult to explain away as ordinary, even for someone who tried very hard to explain things away. He retreated to his diary and kept writing, and the diary became, without him quite noticing, less about complaining and more about trying to understand what was happening around him. Lucy stood at the prow as Narrowhaven disappeared, and she breathed in the salt air, and she felt the ship moving beneath her feet, and she was glad. Some days later, after long stretches of open sea, where the only company was water and sky and the occasional seabird, the Dawn Treader came within sight of another island. This one was green and wooded, its trees growing close to the water's edge, and it had the look of a place that had been left to itself for a long time. The sounds that came from it were ordinary forest sounds. Birds, wind in leaves, the distant murmur of a stream. And yet there was something unusual about the beach as the crew drew close. There were footprints in the sand. This would not have been unusual, except that the footprints were appearing as they watched. Not old footprints, slowly revealed by tide, but fresh ones, pressing themselves into the sand one after another, as though someone was walking there. And yet there was no one to be seen. Whatever was making those footprints was invisible. The crew went very still. Some of them reached for weapons, others simply stared. Reepicheep, characteristically, watched with interest and no particular alarm, as though invisible creatures were a curious development rather than a frightening one. Then the invisible things spoke. There were many of them. Their voices came from everywhere along the beach, overlapping and tumbling over each other. And what they said, stripped of the general noise and confusion, was this: they needed help. They had been made invisible by a magician, and they could not make themselves visible again. They needed someone to go into the magician's house and read a particular spell from his book. A spell that would undo what had been done to them, and the person who had to do it, for reasons to do with the nature of the spell, had to be a girl. All eyes went to Lucy. Lucy agreed to go. She always did. Not without thinking. She thought about it carefully, quietly, the way she thought about most things. But she understood that some things simply need doing, and the one who can do them might as well be the one who does. She took the path up through the trees toward the magician's house, walking alone in the cool green light of the forest, listening to the soft sounds around her. The magician's house was large and still. It had the feeling of a place that was used to silence, that had organized itself around quiet. The rooms she passed through were full of shelves and books and strange objects that caught the light and held it in interesting ways, and Lucy moved through them carefully, touching nothing she didn't need to touch. She found the book. It was enormous. The kind of book that takes up most of a desk just by being there. Its pages were thick and soft, and each one was covered in writing and illustrations so detailed and alive that looking at them was almost like looking through a window rather than at a page. The book was arranged by subject, and Lucy began turning pages, looking for the spell that would make the invisible things visible again. She found other spells along the way. Some were interesting, some were strange. One was simply beautiful. A spell described as a way of refreshing yourself in the middle of a hard journey, and the words of it, as she read them, had a kind of rhythm that felt like being in a garden in early summer, when everything is growing and the light is long and golden. Then she found a different spell, and she stopped. This spell was called a spell to make the speaker beautiful, beyond the beauty of mortals. And next to it was an illustration, a face drawn in such careful lines that it looked almost like a photograph rather than a drawing. The face was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was the kind of face that fills a room without trying, that makes every other face seem a little quieter by comparison. Lucy looked at it for a long time. She thought about Susan, her older sister. Susan had that kind of beauty. Susan, wherever she was, walked into rooms and people noticed. People always noticed Susan. Lucy had spent a great deal of her life being the smaller one, the younger one, the one standing a little to the side while Susan drew the light. She had never been bitter about it. Not really. But she had noticed it. It is very hard not to notice these things. She began to read the spell. She read the words quietly, carefully, and as she read them, the air in the room shifted, and for a moment she was somewhere else. A vision, a kind of dream laid over the room around her. She saw herself, but different, older, extraordinary in the way that Susan was extraordinary. People were looking at her the way they looked at Susan. Everyone wanted to know her. Everyone was drawn to her. And then, in the vision, she looked for herself. She looked for Lucy. And Lucy wasn't there. Because if she had been Susan, she would never have been Lucy. And without Lucy, things that mattered, things in Narnia, things in the lives of people she loved, would not have happened, could not have happened. A great golden face appeared in the vision, gentle and serious and kind. Aslan's face. And the spell broke. Lucy came back to herself, standing at the book, her heart beating in an unsteady way. She stood quietly for a moment, breathing. Then she turned the pages and found the spell she had actually come for. She read the visibility spell aloud, her voice careful and steady in the quiet room. And something happened. Not in the room, but outside and below and everywhere at once. There was a general ripple, like a stone dropped in still water, and then, on the beach, and in the trees, and along the path she had walked, shapes began to appear. They were very strange shapes. Each creature was small and round, with a broad, cheerful face, and a single enormous foot. Just the one, planted firmly beneath them like a round paddle. They hopped about on this single foot with a great deal of energy and enthusiasm, and their voices, which had been disembodied and scattered before, now came from very specific directions and very specific faces. And those faces were, nearly all of them, smiling. These were the Dufflepuds. They were absurd. They were also, rather clearly, delighted to be visible again. They hopped and called to each other and made the general noise of creatures who have been going through something difficult and have just come out the other side of it. And the relief was genuinely moving, even if the hopping made it slightly comedic. They congratulated each other on being visible. They congratulated Lucy for making them visible. They congratulated themselves on having the idea to ask her in the first place, and they did this last part with great enthusiasm, apparently not finding anything strange about being proud of something that had been Coriokin's idea entirely. They were, in short, wonderful. Lucy came down from the magician's house and found the crew on the beach, looking at the Dufflepuds with the various expressions of people trying to decide what exactly the correct response to a Dufflepud is. The Dufflepuds were very pleased to see all of them. They said so several times. Later, when the immediate business of visibility had settled, and the Dufflepuds had calmed somewhat, Lucy encountered the magician himself, a tall, elderly man named Coriocan, who had the manner of someone who has lived long enough to find most things interesting rather than alarming. He was a star, he explained, or had been, placed here by Aslan to govern these creatures in a specific way, for reasons that weren't entirely clear, but that he seemed at peace with. He and Lucy spoke for a while about many things. He showed her a map, an extraordinary map of the seas to the east, more detailed and more accurate than anything the Dawn Treader carried, showing islands and currents and landmarks that no chart they had previously owned had managed to capture. He gave this to them freely, because it was needed, and because he was, underneath the strangeness, a generous person. He warned her, too, about what lay ahead. There was darkness further east, a particular kind of darkness, a place where the worst fears of anyone who entered it came to life around them. He spoke of it quietly, without drama, but with the seriousness of someone who wants to be sure you understand. Lucy listened. She stored all of it away. And as she was leaving, in the still of the late afternoon, she heard something. Not a voice, exactly, but something close to one. Something warm and certain and very familiar. Somewhere just beyond where she could point to. It said nothing she could translate into words. It was more like a confirmation than a message. A way of saying, I am here. You are not alone. Go on, she went on. They left the island the following morning. The duffel-puds gathered at the water's edge to wave them off, hopping enthusiastically on their single feet, and the crew of the Dawn Treader waved back with the warm affection you feel for creatures who are odd, but entirely well-meaning. The map from Coriocan was spread out on the table in the captain's quarters, and Caspian and his navigator bent over it with serious attention. There were more islands ahead. There was the darkness that Coriocan had mentioned. And beyond all of that, if Caspian and Reepicheep were right, and if the old stories were true, there was the edge of the world, where the water rolled away into something else entirely. Reepicheep stood at the prow and looked east, the way he always did, with a calm and settled certainty that they were heading in exactly the right direction. The next island they reached was larger than the others, and wilder. It had the look of a place that had never been properly explored. Thick with dark trees, its interior shadowed and untouched, its shores rocky and sharp. The crew brought the ship into a sheltered inlet and prepared to go ashore to look for fresh water and to rest, and to see whether this island held anything relevant to their search. From the beach, the island seemed quiet. The trees were old and tall, and their roots reached down to the rocks with the slow, patient determination of things that have been growing in one place for a very long time. Beyond the trees, somewhere in the interior, there were sounds that might have been water or might have been something else entirely. Eustace did not enjoy the island any more than he had enjoyed anything else on the voyage, but he particularly did not enjoy the heat, the walking, and the general activity of being among people who knew what they were doing. He fell behind the group, and then further behind, and then in the way of someone who has been slightly miserable for long enough that they have stopped paying careful attention, he wandered away entirely. He hadn't meant to get lost. He never meant anything that happened to him. Things simply happened, and Eustace found himself on the receiving end of them, usually with strong feelings and somewhere to note them down. He walked through the trees, following no particular path, and the sounds of the crew faded behind him, and then there was just the island, and the heat, and the strange, heavy silence of the interior. He kept walking. He came eventually to a place where the trees thinned and the ground rose, and there was a cave. It was a large cave, dark at its mouth, and from inside it came the smell of something old and dry, something metallic and heavy that Eustace could not immediately identify. He went inside. The cave was vast. The ceiling was lost in the darkness above, and the floor was covered in things. Gold things, mostly. Coins and chains and goblets and pieces of armor and jewels still set in their settings. All of it piled and heaped and spread across the stone floor in the careless, extravagant way of something that has accumulated rather than been arranged. There was treasure everywhere. Mountains of it. Eustace walked through it slowly, his feet crunching over coins, his hands brushing aside chains, and it was impossible not to feel something in the presence of so much of it. Some quiet pull, the way gold has always had a pull on people, not because gold itself is powerful, but because what it represents in the human imagination is so very large. And there was a dragon. The dragon was not in that moment particularly frightening. It was dying. It lay in the far reaches of the cave, enormous and grey and still, its breath coming slowly and unevenly, its eyes half closed. It was very old, so old that the life was almost out of it, and what was left was simply the final hours of something that had once been powerful and was now simply waiting. Its scales were dull, its wings folded flat, its great body filling the back of the cave the way a fallen tree fills a forest clearing, taking up more space than seemed quite possible, and very still. Eustace watched it for a little while, and then the dragon gave one last slow breath and was still, and the cave was very quiet. Eustace was tired. He was hot. He had been walking for a long time, and he was miserable and he wanted to lie down. The treasure was everywhere, and the cave was cool, and so, without thinking carefully about what he was doing, which was rather the story of Eustace's day, he settled himself into the treasure, pulled some of it around him for comfort, and lay down. He closed his eyes. He thought about how unfair everything was. He thought about the voyage and the discomfort, and how nobody seemed to properly appreciate that he was finding all of this extremely difficult. He thought about home, about his room, about his books with their comfortable columns of facts. He did not think about the bracelet he had absently slipped onto his wrist from the pile of treasure. A broad gold bracelet set with stones. Something that had belonged to the dragon. Something that carried in it the slow accumulation of a dragon's long life. He slept. When he woke up, the cave looked different, larger. Everything in it seemed smaller than it had before, and the light. The thin grey light that came from the cave entrance seemed very far away. He looked at his hands. They were not hands. They were large and scaled and dark, with claws where his fingers had been, and when he opened his mouth to make a sound of shock, a sound of protest, the kind of sound that Eustace had a great deal of practice making. What came out was not words. He stumbled out of the cave and found a pool of water near the entrance, and he looked at his reflection, and what looked back at him was a dragon, a young one, small by dragon standards, but enormous by any other measure, dark-scaled and broad, and thoroughly un-Eustace in every physical way. But behind the eyes, which were the one thing that hadn't changed, there was still Eustace, confused, frightened, very much not enjoying this development, and without the words to say so. The bracelet he had put on was embedded now in the flesh of his foreleg, too small for the limb it was on, pressing painfully into the scales. It was a reminder of where he had been, and what he had done, and it hurt. Back at the ship, Eustace's absence had been noted. A search had been organized. crew members fanning out through the trees, calling his name, listening for a response. The response, when it came, was nothing like what they had expected. A dragon came out of the trees. It came slowly, not attacking, not threatening, but moving in the careful, deliberate way of something that is trying very hard to communicate something and is not sure how. It landed on the beach near the ship and looked at them. The crew went still, hands going to weapons, eyes wide. And then the dragon did something strange. It began to cry. Not roaring, not growling, not any of the sounds a dragon is meant to make, but tears, real ones, running down its enormous, scaled face, while it looked at them with eyes that were somehow not quite a dragon's eyes. There was something in them that was, unmistakably, human. Lucy was the one who understood first. She stepped forward, very gently, and looked at the dragon carefully, and she asked whether it was Eustace. The dragon nodded. They could not change him back. Not immediately, not on the island, not with anything they had available. So they made do. Eustace, in his dragon form, was useful in ways that human Eustace had never been. He could carry things that would have taken many men to move. He could fly reconnaissance above the trees, and the fire he could breathe, when directed carefully, turned out to be excellent for cooking. But more than any of this, something had shifted in Eustace himself. Being a dragon is, among other things, a very effective cure for a certain kind of self-importance. When you cannot speak, you cannot argue. When you cannot write in your diary, you cannot record your grievances. When you are dependent on the goodwill of people you have been unkind to, and those people turn out to be kinder than you deserve, something begins to change in the way you see things. Reepicheep spent time with Dragon Eustace in the evenings. He would sit near the enormous creature and simply talk, telling stories, asking questions that didn't require answers, being present in a warm and uncomplicated way. This was not a small thing. Reepicheep's company, offered so straightforwardly, without judgment or expectation, seemed to reach Eustace in a way that many things hadn't. Eustace followed the ship when it moved, flying above or swimming alongside, and the crew grew accustomed to having him, and in growing accustomed to him, they began, perhaps, to like him a little more than they had before. There is something about someone being genuinely vulnerable, stripped of all their defenses and pretenses. That makes it easier to see them clearly. One night, late, when the ship was at anchor and the crew was sleeping and the island was very still, Eustace woke. Dragon Eustace, lying on the beach, one eye opening, looking up at a sky full of stars. There was someone there. It was a lion, large and luminous, its presence filling the space around it the way light fills a room when you open the curtains. Gradually, completely, in a way that makes it hard to remember what the darkness felt like. Aslan stood at the edge of the water and looked at Eustace with eyes that held a great deal. Kindness, certainly, but also a kind of clear-sightedness, a seeing through of things that was not entirely comfortable to be on the receiving end of. Eustace had been looked at by many people in his life, and most of the time he had found ways to redirect the looking, or dismiss it, or ignore it. This look was not the kind you could redirect or dismiss. It was simply there, and you were simply in it. Aslan led him to a pool of water, and then he told Eustace to undress. Eustace thought this was a strange instruction, given that he had no clothes, but he reached up and scratched at his scales, and a layer of them peeled away. Like a skin, exactly like a skin. And underneath it was more dragon. He scratched again, deeper, and peeled away more, and it was still dragon. He tried a third time, and he couldn't go deep enough. couldn't reach whatever was underneath. Then Aslan said that he would have to do it, and his claws went in deeper than Eustace's could, and the pain of it was real, sharp and impossible to ignore. But on the other side of the pain was something else entirely. Layer after layer came away, and underneath the last one was not a dragon at all. Eustace stood at the edge of the pool, human again, shivering in the cool air, and Aslan helped him into the water, and the water was warm, and the pain dissolved in it, and he came out on the other side, changed in a way that had nothing to do with his scales. The bracelet was gone too. That tight gold band that had pressed into his dragon flesh all through the voyage, the reminder of the moment he had taken something that wasn't his and put it on without thinking. It was simply absent when he emerged from the water. He didn't notice its absence the way he would have noticed pain or cold. He just felt lighter. He felt, for possibly the first time in his life, genuinely and completely comfortable in his own body, in a way that had nothing to do with warmth or softness or any physical thing at all. He came back to the ship the next morning in human form. The crew stared. Several of them were unsure, briefly, whether this was actually Eustace or someone who simply looked like him. But it was Eustace, recognizably himself in face and voice, and yet different in some quality that was harder to name. He apologized, not in the loud, defensive way of someone performing an apology, because it's expected, but quietly, one person at a time. He said sorry to Caspian. He said sorry to the crew members he had been rude to. He said sorry to Reepicheep, who received the apology with gracious dignity. He did not entirely stop writing in his diary, but the entries changed. They became less about his own discomfort and more about what was happening around him, what people were doing, what he was learning. The tone of them shifted from complaint to something that resembled, cautiously, wonder. He was not a perfectly reformed character overnight. Real change doesn't work like that. But the direction had changed, and that was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The sea to the east, as they continued their journey, had been getting quieter. Not in a peaceful way. The quiet of open water on a clear day is different from this. This quiet had an edge to it. The colors of the water deepened. The sky seemed to press closer. The light, which had been golden and easy in the western parts of these seas, grew grey and then greyer. And then, one day, they sailed into darkness. It was a dark mist. That is the simplest way to describe it, though simple doesn't quite cover it. It was the color of deep shadow. Not black exactly, but a darkness that had texture to it, that seemed almost solid even as the ship moved through it. The temperature dropped. Sound behaved differently inside it, coming from odd directions, seeming to land in the wrong places. The crew slowed the ship. Lanterns were lit. People moved closer together without quite realizing they were doing it. Caspian looked ahead through the darkness with an expression of deliberate calm. The expression of someone who has decided not to show what they are feeling because other people are watching. Inside the dark mist, things began to happen. They happened quietly, which made them harder to deal with than if they had been loud. A sound that one of the crew was certain he recognized. A shape at the edge of the lamplight that looked, for a moment, like something it couldn't possibly be. A voice that seemed to come from nowhere and said a name, the wrong name, the one that made someone's breath go short. The mist fed on fears. It pulled them up from wherever people kept them. The quiet places where you store the things you don't want to look at directly. And it showed them to you in the dark, dressed in just enough reality to be convincing. It was not loud or violent. It was precise. It knew where to look. Eustace felt it too. Edmund felt it. Lucy felt it. The fears were different for each of them, and they were real fears. Not invented horrors, but the actual things that each person carried, the particular shapes of their own particular dread. The crew began to pull against each other. Trust, under pressure, develops hairline cracks. Small misunderstandings becoming larger ones. Caution becoming suspicion. The general strain of being frightened in a confined space, beginning to tell on people in small ways. In the water, barely visible, something called out. A voice, weak and strained, begging them to stop. To not come any further, but also, desperately, to not leave. They brought him aboard. He was a man, older than any of them, thin and wild-eyed, his clothes in rags, his hands shaking with a tremor that didn't stop. His name was Roop, Lord Roop. He had been in that darkness for he didn't know how long. He had lost track. Inside the dark mist, time worked differently, and your nightmares were always present, and sleep brought them closer rather than further away. He begged them, with a specific and exhausted urgency, not to sleep. In there, he said, you did not want to sleep. He had his sword with him still, the sword that identified him as one of the 7 lords, and he surrendered it to Caspian with the relief of someone handing over something they have been carrying too long. He was 6. 6 of the 7 swords were now aboard the Dawn Treader. But they were still inside the dark mist, and it was pressing closer. From somewhere in the darkness, below the surface perhaps, or moving through the mist itself, something large began to move. It broke the surface off the bow. Enormous, scaled, dark, moving with the slow power of something that is very big and has no reason to hurry. A sea serpent. It wrapped itself around the hull of the Dawn Treader with the casual, terrible certainty of something that does this because it can. And the wood groaned under the pressure, and the crew scrambled. They fought it. Everyone who could fight did. Caspian, Edmund, the crew, Eustace, all of them doing what they could against something that was almost beyond the scale of ordinary fighting. Reepicheep, unfazed, did his part with his small sword, and an absolute refusal to treat the situation as anything other than a problem to be solved. The serpent was not destroyed. Nothing as clean as that. It was forced back, partly, enough to free the ship from the worst of the grip. But the damage was done, and the darkness was still around them, and the crew was frightened in a way that was very difficult to steady. Lucy went to the prow of the ship. The darkness was everywhere, above and below and in all directions, and the lanterns barely pushed it back, and the crew was quiet with a frightened kind of quiet that is worse than noise. She looked into the darkness, and she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. She simply said Aslan's name. She asked for help. She said it the way you say something, when you mean it completely, when you are not performing the asking, but simply asking, with all the plainness and all the urgency of someone who has run out of other options and has arrived at the one thing that was always going to be the right one. The darkness did not immediately disappear, but something changed in it. A shift, almost imperceptible at first, a very faint lightening somewhere ahead of the ship, a direction where the mist seemed less absolute. Then there was a bird. It came from the direction of the light. A large, white bird, wings spread, moving through the mist with the ease of something that belongs to the light and has no difficulty with the dark. It flew above the prow of the ship and called once, clearly, and then began to fly ahead, slowly enough for the ship to follow. The crew saw it. Caspian saw it. Without discussing it, without needing to discuss it, the navigator turned the ship to follow the bird, and they sailed after it, and the light ahead grew steadily clearer, and the darkness around them became lighter, and then lighter still, and then between one moment and the next, they were through. The mist was behind them. The sky ahead was open, wide and pale and real, lit by a sun that had presence and warmth, and the particular quality of light that makes everything it touches look like itself. The crew breathed. Several of them sat down. Lord Roop, who had been braced against the railing with the desperate grip of someone who has been through too much to trust anything, slowly let go. When they looked back, the dark mist was still there. A solid, dark mass sitting on the water. But it was behind them, not around them. And that made all the difference. Behind them it stayed. It did not follow. It was a thing of a particular place, and they had left that place, and the world ahead was nothing like it. Lord Roop sat in the warmth of the deck, and slowly, over the hours that followed, stopped shaking. The crew tended to the damage the serpent had done to the hull and rigging, working with the focused practicality of people who know how to fix things, and the Dawn Treader, under their care, became herself again. The seventh and final sword was still missing. One more lord, one more island. The eastern edge of the world was somewhere ahead, and Koryakin's map suggested they were getting close. Reepicheep stood at the prow, as always, looking east with his particular expression of quiet certainty. And the ship moved on. Something about the sea changed in the days after they left the dark mist behind. It was not a sudden change, nothing so dramatic. It was more like a gradual lifting, a slow brightening, the way a room fills with light in the morning, not in one moment, but in a series of small increments until you realize that the dark is entirely gone. The water here was a different color. Not the deep blue of the open sea, not the gray of the waters near the dark island, but something warmer, a blue that leaned toward green, or perhaps a green that leaned toward gold, depending on where the sun sat. The sky above was clearer than any sky they had seen since leaving Narnia. The colors of everything, the sails, the wood of the deck, the faces of the crew, seemed slightly more vivid, as though the air itself was doing something to the light. The crew noticed. They moved more quietly than usual, not from fear but from something closer to reverence, the feeling of being in a place that asks you to lower your voice without quite telling you why. Conversations on deck became shorter and softer. People stood at the railing and looked at the water more than they usually did. Eustace stood at the railing one morning and watched the sea go by and didn't write anything in his diary and didn't complain. He just looked. It was, perhaps, the most Eustace had ever grown in a single morning. Further east, the water changed again. It became shallow, so shallow that you could see the bottom, and the bottom was covered in the most remarkable plants, like tall grass made of light, swaying in the gentle current. And the color of it was something between crystal and milk, white and clear and luminous, the kind of clarity that makes things not invisible but impossibly visible, as though you are seeing them not just with your eyes, but with something else entirely. And the water was sweet. Not salt, as ocean water should be. Sweet. Someone tasted it carefully, held a cupped hand up to the surface, and drank from it, and then looked at the others with an expression of puzzled delight. It was sweet. It was the most extraordinary water any of them had ever tasted. It tasted like the idea of water, rather than water itself, if that makes any sense at all. And out here, in these seas, it did. Lilies appeared. They floated on the surface in their thousands, white and quiet, and the ship moved through them carefully, and the air above them was full of a scent that was simply good. Not perfume, not sweetness exactly, but something that made breathing feel like an occasion, as though the air itself was worth noticing. Even Eustace breathed it in, and said nothing critical at all. Ahead of them, as they continued east, a shape grew on the horizon. At first it was just a difference in the quality of light, a brightness in the east that was not quite the sun. Then it became something more defined. A whiteness, a luminosity, a place where the sky seemed to fold downward, and the water seemed to fold upward, and the two met in a way that was difficult to look at directly. They were approaching the edge. The word doesn't quite cover it. The edge of the world sounds like a concept, an idea, something you might discuss in a philosophy lesson. This was not a concept. It was a place, an actual place, with water and sky and light, and rising from the water as they drew closer, a wave. A single stationary wave, standing tall and still as a wall of glass, the water behind it folding up and over into something that the eye couldn't quite follow. The world ended here, and on the other side of the wave was somewhere else. But before the wave, there was an island. It was low and grassy, with gentle slopes and a flat, open center. And on that flat center, there was a stone table. A long one, the length of many people lying end to end, covered in food. Real food. Good food. The kind of food that suggests someone prepared it and cared about it and wanted the people who ate it to feel welcome. The food was fresh, which was remarkable, given that there was no one immediately visible who had prepared it or could be maintaining it. Around the table in chairs were 3 men. They were asleep. Not ordinarily asleep. The deep, placed sleep of enchantment, the kind you recognize because people in it are too still, their faces too peaceful, their breathing too even. But they were clearly alive. And standing near the table, in the light, which here was particularly beautiful, particularly clear, was a young woman. She was the daughter of Ramandu, a star who had once moved through the night sky and was now at rest on this island. And she had the particular quality of someone who is genuinely at home where they are. Someone for whom this island and this light and this quiet are simply the ordinary world. Caspian saw her, and he stood very still, and something in his expression settled in a way that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with her. She was calm and direct and kind. She answered their questions without making them feel that the questions were simple ones. She told them what had happened to the 3 sleeping men, Lords Mavramorn, Argos, and Revilian, who had sat at this table and eaten from it, and quarrelled over something that the enchanted food had turned into a curse, leaving them in this deep sleep, a sleep that could only be broken when someone sailed to the edge of the world and laid the 7 swords on the table. She was patient in her explanations. She did not rush. The light around her as she spoke had the quality of late afternoon light in summer, warm and particular, the kind that makes shadows long and soft and everything it touches seem at ease. She explained that the food on the table renewed itself each day, brought there by birds from Aslan's country to the east. She said this matter-of-factly, not as something miraculous, but as something that simply was the way you describe rain as coming from clouds, as a natural function of the world, because to her, this close to the edge, the line between ordinary and extraordinary, had become very thin. Caspian listened to everything she said with great attention. His eyes did not leave her face when she spoke, and when she paused, he asked careful questions, and she answered them with the same unhurried calm. There was something in the space between them, something that neither of them named, because naming it would have been rushing it, that the rest of the group politely gave it space. They needed the 7th sword, and it was there. The 3rd Lord's sword, Roop having provided the 6th, the 3 sleeping lords providing the final 3. All 7 were now on the Dawn Treader. Caspian took each sword in turn and laid it on the table. Lucy and Edmund helped. Eustace stood close, watching carefully, understanding for the first time since arriving in Narnia what it meant for something to be genuinely important. The swords were placed side by side, their hilts touching, their blades catching the extraordinary light of this place. Something happened when the last one was placed. Not a dramatic happening, not light or noise or anything theatrical. More like the world exhaling. The tension that had been present since they first heard about the green mist and the dark island, and the missing lord simply released, the way a sound you'd been hearing so long you'd stopped noticing it. Finally stops, and you feel the difference in the quiet. The 3 lords at the table stirred. Not all at once. Gradually, the way people wake from deep and peaceful sleep, moving first in small ways, turning a hand, shifting a shoulder, before their eyes opened. When they woke, they were confused, as people are when they have been asleep for a very long time. They did not know where they were, not immediately. They did not know how much time had passed. But they were alive, and they were themselves, and the enchantment had broken, and that was what mattered. Lord Roop, who had come aboard in the darkness with his own particular damage, found himself among his fellow lords, and there was something in the seeing of familiar faces after so long that was difficult to watch. Not because it was sad, but because it was so genuinely glad that it made its own kind of silence around it. 6 of the 7 lords were alive. Lord Restimar, who had fallen into the golden pool on the Dragon's Island and been lost to it, could not be recovered. His sword had been taken. His fate was what it was. But the others, found or freed, each in their different way, had been brought to this table, and the promise Caspian had made at the beginning of the voyage was very close to being kept. They did not sail through the great wave. Some did, or tried to. Reepicheep, in his small coracle, went ahead toward it with the absolute serenity of someone who has been expecting this moment their whole life, and is simply, finally, arriving at it. He had moved his belongings into the small coracle days before reaching this island, quietly and without ceremony, as though this was simply the next practical step in a journey he had always known would end here. He did not say goodbye in any formal way. He spoke to Lucy and Edmund, and Caspian, and Eustace, with the same warmth and directness he had always shown them, and perhaps his eyes held something, and perhaps that something was a kind of completeness, a sense of arriving at the exact place you were always going. But he did not make speeches about it. He was not the kind of creature who needed to make a ceremony of something that was already, in itself, ceremonious enough. He moved through the lily-covered water in his little boat, paddling steadily, his small grey figure growing smaller and then smaller still, and the wave received him, and he was gone, and no one who saw it felt sad about it, because it was so clearly right. It was the most correct thing that happened on the entire voyage. A creature who had always been heading in exactly one direction arriving, at last, at the place where that direction was always taking him. There was no better ending for Reepicheep. There could not have been. Aslan appeared on the shore. He was larger than he ever seemed in memory. Not because he had grown, but because here, near the edge of the world, the usual intermediary layers between him and the world around him were simply absent. He was completely himself, without dilution. He spoke to Lucy first. He told her that she and Edmund had grown, and that their doors to Narnia were closed now. Not as a punishment, not as a loss, but because the world they lived in needed them in it. He told her that she would find him there, in her own world, called by a different name. He asked her not to come back to Narnia, searching for him when he was already in her own world, waiting to be found. Lucy was heartbroken in the way that comes from love, not from anything wrong. She had never loved Narnia, because she didn't love home. She had loved both, and the thought of choosing one was the thought of losing something irreplaceable. She cried. She was allowed to cry. Aslan didn't ask her not to. He was very patient with her tears. He simply let them be what they were. The evidence of love, which is never a small thing, which is always worth the grief it sometimes costs. She said goodbye to Narnia in the way that you say goodbye to something you know has been true. Not cheerfully. There was nothing cheerful in it. But completely. She let it be a real goodbye, a full one, and that made it, in the end, a good one. Edmund, older and steadier, received the news differently. He was sad, too, but his sadness was the quieter kind. The kind that accepts things because it has learned to trust that the things that happens are not arbitrary, even when they hurt. He nodded. He understood. He would carry Narnia in him, not as a place he could return to, but as something that had shaped him beyond undoing. To Eustace, Aslan said something different. He said that Eustace might return. Not certainly and not soon, but perhaps. And Eustace, who had arrived in Narnia as a boy who didn't believe in anything he hadn't measured or classified, received this news with a kind of wide-eyed gratitude that was very different from the Eustace who had complained his way through the early weeks of the voyage. The island felt different after Aslan had spoken. Not emptier. Fuller, if anything. The way a room feels after something important has happened in it. Lucy looked at the table, at the swords laid across it, at the vast stretch of lily-bright water to the east, at the great wave standing where the world ended. She tried to take it all in the way you try to remember the details of something you know you're leaving, storing it in a part of yourself where it will be kept carefully. Caspian said his goodbyes to them with the genuine feeling of someone who knows that some friendships are shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and that the end of the circumstances does not end the friendship, but does change it into something you carry rather than something you return to. He thanked them. He thanked them in the particular way of someone who means it completely, without decoration. Ramandu's daughter stood apart, watching. Her eyes found Caspian's and held them, and there was, in that quiet exchange, the beginning of something that the story does not dwell on. A future that belongs to Narnia, rather than to the children who are leaving it. Reepicheep was already gone. Somewhere past the wave, in a country where the grass is always gold, and the light is always this quality of light that makes everything feel more itself. He had gotten there. He had kept his faith in it, and sailed toward it, and arrived. It was hard to be sad about Reepicheep. A wave came. Not the great standing wave at the edge of the world. A smaller one, warm and certain, that gathered around Lucy and Edmund and Eustace where they stood, and lifted them and carried them, and the island and the lily-bright sea and Caspian's face receded as though the world were a painting being gently rolled up, and then they were in Eustace's bedroom. They were wet. They were on the floor. The ordinary, familiar air of Cambridge was around them. The smell of the house, the sound of a street outside, the grey English light coming through the window. On the wall above them, the painting hung in its frame, still and quiet and entirely flat, showing a ship on a painted sea that did not move. They sat up. They looked at each other. They were back. Eustace looked at the painting for a long time. The weeks that followed were different for all three of them in different ways. Edmund and Lucy moved back through their English lives with the careful grace of people who carry a secret too large to share without sounding mad, and have long since made peace with that. They were warmer to each other. They were, perhaps, warmer to most people, not in an obvious way, not in a way that required explaining. Just quietly, the way people are when they have seen enough to know that warmth matters. They didn't talk about Narnia much, even to each other, not because it was painful, but because some things are held rather than discussed. They would occasionally catch each other's eye across a room when something happened that reminded them. A particular quality of light, a smell that was almost but not quite salt water, the sound of wind in the right kind of trees, and the look they exchanged would carry a whole conversation in it, the way old shared knowledge always does. Eustace went back to school. He was, by most accounts, a changed person. Not completely, because complete transformations are the stuff of stories, and life is usually slower and messier than that, but changed enough. His classmates noticed that he was less inclined to correct people in the particular way that makes people feel small. He was less certain, in the way that made him mean. He was more curious, in the way that makes you ask rather than pronounce. He made a friend, which had not previously been something he was especially good at. He did not talk about Narnia to people who wouldn't believe him. He understood now that there are some experiences that belong inside you rather than in conversation. Things you carry not to prove anything, but simply to know. He looked at the painting sometimes. He had asked Lucy if he could have it when everything settled, and she had said yes, and so it hung in his room now, that ship on that golden sea, that carved lion at the prow. He looked at it in the quiet of the evening, and something in his chest was warm and still and patient. He believed he would go back. Not because Aslan had promised him exactly. The word used had been perhaps, which is a long way from a guarantee. But he believed it. The belief was calm and steady, not desperate, not frantic, just there. The way you believe in things that have already been real. He believed he would see Narnia again, and in the believing, Narnia was, in some way that cannot be fully explained, already there. In his diary, which he still kept, because some habits are harder to leave than scales, the entries had changed entirely. They were less like a record and more like notes to himself, reminders. Small pieces of what he had learned, written down so he wouldn't forget them. Things like, being frightened is not the same as being weak. Things like, people are usually kinder than you expect if you let them be. Things like, the world is larger than it shows you at first, much larger. And that is a good thing. He had written that last one on a night when the house was quiet, and the painting on his wall was lit by the lamp on his desk, and the ship on the water looked almost, just almost, like it was moving. Lucy, too, had something to carry home with her. Aslan had told her she would find him in her own world, called by a different name. She thought about that in the quiet of her room, late at night, when Cambridge was still and the house was asleep. She thought about what it meant to find someone when you were not looking for them by the right name. She thought about all the times she had felt, in ordinary moments, in the green of summer leaves, in the warmth of a fire, in the particular goodness of a kind word from the right person at the right time, something she hadn't been able to name. Perhaps she had been finding him all along. That thought did not make Narnia less. It made the ordinary world more. Edmund, for his part, did what Edmund usually did. He thought carefully and quietly, and he stored what he had learned, and he got on with things. He was not the kind of person who required the extraordinary to feel the weight of it. He had been through enough, in enough different places, to know that the extraordinary and the ordinary are usually the same thing, seen from different distances. He was a good brother to Lucy. He was, as time passed, a good man. The painting stayed still. It hung on the wall, a frame of gold and wood around a ship on a sea, the sails full of what looked like a painted wind that would never actually blow. People who saw it thought it was a nice painting, a pleasant image, the kind of thing you put on a wall and stop really seeing after a while, the way you stop seeing most ordinary things. Lucy saw it every time. She would pass through the room where it hung, and sometimes she would stop, and she would look at the carved lion at the prow, and the painted sea that had once been real beneath her feet, and the painted sky that had once been above her head, and she would remember. Not the difficult parts, not the dark mist or the fear or the serpent or the grief of the last goodbye. She remembered the good parts. She remembered the smell of salt and morning on the deck of the Dawn Treader, standing at the railing watching the sea wake up. She remembered the sweet water near the edge of the world, how it tasted like nothing she had words for, how it made the inside of her feel clean and still. She remembered Reepicheep at the prow, looking east, always east, with that complete and quiet certainty. She remembered Caspian, grown and good and smiling. She remembered Aslan's face in the vision, gentle and clear, and looking at her as though she was exactly enough. She didn't need to go back to know that it was real. And that, in the end, is the most important thing about Narnia. Not the magic, not the talking animals, not the great stone tables and the swords and the enchanted waters. The most important thing is what it does to you when you leave it, the particular way it stays with you, not as nostalgia, not as longing, but as something that has become part of how you see, part of how you move through the world, part of the quiet inside you that knows, without needing to be told, that the world is larger and more beautiful and more full of meaning than it usually shows. The Dawn Treader sailed east. It sails there still, somewhere past the edge of maps, in waters that taste like morning and shimmer with the particular light of a world that is very close to something holy. And if you are very still, if your eyes are closed and your breathing has slowed, and the room around you is quiet, and the ordinary world has stepped back to give you a little space, perhaps you can almost hear it. The creak of the wood, the pull of the sails, the sound of the water parting before the golden hull, and the carved lion at the prow, pressing east, always east, toward the place where everything good is waiting. The end if you are still awake. Try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you like the video. Thanks.